You have your own music?
No.
I'll give you mine. You can use it on all your shows.
I mean, I've got clips of music that I throw
Yeah, I
in,
know you
but,
do.
Yeah.
All right, this is CJ from the Dangerous History Podcast. I don't really know how to interview you. Completely out of my wheelhouse. We're
Okay.
polar opposites. You were a history professor, and I was kicked out of history.
Okay.
All right.
I'm not sure how that works.
I was kicked out of high school.
Oh, okay.
I wasn't kicked out. I dropped out in the 10th grade. Thought I wanted to be a professional dirt bike rider.
Fair enough.
Yeah. All right, so let's talk. What do we talk about? So you just presented End of Empires.
Yes.
Are we fucked?
Possibly.
Can we? If you, I heard somebody asked you, have you ever seen this been reversed? Has an empire ever fallen and it's been saved?
The decline can maybe be temporarily slowed down, even turned around, but only very temporarily, not...
So does it need to be like a phoenix? Do we need to burn it to the ground and rise from the ashes?
That's one possibility. The other thing is just, you might have heard the episode I did with Jack not too long ago on national divorce. My view is that a peaceful and orderly national divorce, sort of along the lines of what happened to the Soviet Union, is probably our best option right now.
But not the most likely.
Probably not.
What do you think is most probable?
That's really hard to say because our leadership class is so irrational and erratic right now that I really don't know what the hell they're trying to do.
Well, I think he's owned by China, maybe. I mean, who knows who he's owned by?
Yeah, and who knows what he actually believes in his twisted senile brain, and maybe more importantly, all the flunkies around him who are probably really running the show. Like, what do they actually believe? I think some of them really do believe in sort of the neoliberal progressive empire idea. I think some of them are like Victoria Nuland or somebody like that. I look at it and go like, oh, she actually believes the crazy crap she's saying.
Yeah, the fraction of 1% that we amplify the loudest.
Yeah. There's a possibility of World War III. World War I was started by mostly a bunch of empires in decline. I think the British Empire was early in its decline. The German Empire, funnily enough, which ends up losing World War I, they were not in decline before the war, but the war took them down. But you look at the other empires that went into World War I. You got the Ottoman Empire clearly in decline. People had been calling it the sick man of Europe for generations before World War I. Austrian Empire almost as in decline as the Ottoman Empire. Then you got the Tsar's Russian Empire. And all three of those empires, the Ottomans, the Romanovs in Russia, the Habsburgs in Austria, they all were in, I think, serious decline. And they all kind of thought that they would go into World War, which they didn't know was going to be World War I. They all thought it would be a quick, easy little war, like the Crimean War or something like that. And they all thought, oh, we're going to go into this war. Of course, we're going to be on the winning side. It's going to be super easy, barely an inconvenience. We'll win in a matter of months. And that'll turn our imperial decline around, make us great again, flex our muscles, show the world we're still badass. And rumors of our decline have been greatly exaggerated. And, of course, ended up killing most of those empires. The Habsburg dynasty fell after 500 years or whatever. The Romanovs, and then also the Ottomans, the Hohenzollerns, all that stuff. So there's a possibility of World War III, and honestly, in the age of nukes, that's the possibility that concerns me the most.
Do you think that'll happen?
I think it's possible. I think it's more possible now than it has been.
Who do you think
decades.
would do it?
I mean, any one of either the U.S., China, Russia, who would strike first? I don't know. It depends on the exact situation. But there's a tendency for leaders to think that they know what they're doing and they've got it under control. And that's another one. I've studied World War I a lot. And when you look back at World War I, the opening phases of that war, not only did everybody assume they were going to be on the winning side and the war would be quick and easy and no problem, but almost nobody thought that the war would turn into what it would turn into. They thought it was just, Austria's got this dispute with Serbia because they killed their prince, and there'll be a little regional war in the Balkans or whatever, and that'll be it. And then things snowball out of control far beyond what anybody intended going into that thing. And that's when I look at like the proxy war in Ukraine right now, it looks to me somewhat like the beginning of World War I as far as like it might spiral out of anyone's intention. And with nukes, there's also the possibility, like most people don't know that the Cuban Missile Crisis was not the only time that nuclear war almost happened during the Cold War.
I heard you say that before.
Yeah, that there was multiple cases throughout the Cold War where it came this close, and it might be something as simple as like the radar malfunctions, and so it looks like there's missiles coming in. Turns out there wasn't. There were cases where
what just happened in Hawaii?
Yeah. There was one incident where an American bomber was carrying a live H-bomb over American territory. I think it was over North Carolina, if I remember right.
Did they lose it?
And they accidentally dropped it.
Yeah.
And it was fully armed and ready to go. And I think all the safety mechanisms malfunctioned except for one, something like this. And, if you just think about what would happen if an American bomber accidentally dropped a nuclear weapon and it detonated on American territory.
We would blame it on somebody else.
Yeah. All you got to do is look at the USS Maine, right? And how quick the people who just wanted war would seize upon that. And it's easier if you're the politicians to do that than it is to say, actually we're incompetent and we can't be trusted with nukes.
Wasn't World War I? I think World War I was fought by spoiled rich kids that all played together as children. I mean, wasn't that kind of...
Yeah, I mean, they were all related to Queen Victoria.
Do you not... I feel like this is all choreographed. Like all this shit in Ukraine, like I feel like it's already planned.
I sometimes think that too. I mean, I have no way to prove that, but sometimes I wonder if the Cold War itself wasn't to some extent that, where there was some secret back channel communication we don't know about.
We're all going to make a lot of money through our defense investments, and
and we'll demonize each other to keep our respective populations.
Because Biden went over to Russia or whatever. I feel like he said, "Okay, I'm going to do this, and you do this, and then we'll do this, and then this will happen, and we'll all make a bunch of money because we're robbing all the money from everywhere else, and there is no more money to be made."
Yeah, and also to distract domestic populations from problems at home.
Yes.
So you tend to forget about the economy sucks and everything's falling apart and the trains are dumping chemicals in Ohio or whatever.
Bread and circuses.
Yeah, exactly. If it's those foreigners over there, it's one of the oldest tricks in the book, right? That
it's our game plan. I mean, we overthrow other governments with it all the time. Why not? Why would it not work within our own borders?
Yeah, but even if it is choreographed to some extent, there's still the possibility of things getting out of control in the same way that, like if you and I were WWF fighting, one of us might accidentally hit the other one for real, and then the other guy goes, "Oh, well, it's on now," I do worry about that.
I mean, they're building all these bunkers. You have all these rich people have these escape plans and shit. I mean, something's coming. Or maybe they've always done it, and we're just now more aware of it. I don't know.
Yeah, and then, I worry about the possibility of some sort of civil war, some sort of, if parts of the country try to secede and other parts try to hold them by force, where does that go? And that can turn very ugly. Not something I'm in favor of. I know there's some sort of like collapsitarian type people who are like eager to start Civil War II. And
I got friends that are just like, come on, what are we waiting for? Not that they're going to start it, but they would definitely welcome it.
Yeah, and I understand the impulse to be like, fuck these other people, whatever like that.
It's different when your electricity's out for 72 hours versus not ever coming back on.
Yeah. And when you study something like the breakdown of Yugoslavia in the 90s and conflicts like that, and how quickly it just turns ugly. It just turns into like neighbors trying to massacre neighbors. It's, I don't think this should be anybody's plan A, for sure. I think something like the Soviet breakup is probably our best possible outcome. Unfortunately, I don't see anybody on the horizon as far as American politicians at high levels who could play the role of Gorbachev, to be willing to take this thing over and preside over it collapsing and refuse to use brute force to try and hold it together. I don't see anybody out there right now who could do that.
Well, they're obviously willing to use brute force when there's not even a civil war.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I definitely, I don't see the current administration for sure, or any of the recent ones being willing to allow a part of the country to go its separate way without any kind of
Yeah.
a fight. It is kind of interesting how, and I've posted on social media about this, how they'll, when you're talking to somebody, um, and you say, oh, I think it'd be better if this country broke up into smaller pieces, they'll go, but that would cause a war. And you go, well, doesn't necessarily have to. There's cases in history where a country breaks up into smaller pieces or whatever in a peaceful, amicable way, and it's fine. And then they go, yeah, but we wouldn't let you go.
Yeah. That's what they mean. They mean I would cause a war.
Yeah. So it's, I'm like, all right, I want to divorce you because this is a really dysfunctional relationship. And then they're like, well, you can't file for divorce. That will lead to violence. I go, why does that necessarily lead to violence? Well, because I'll use violence to prevent you from leaving. It's like, oh, okay, so you're a psychopath. And, and that's the reason I have to stay tied to you in a sacred union. Is because you're threatening me.
Because I need your resources and I need your money that you work for, so that I don't have to work as hard.
Yeah. It's I don't see how this thing is sustainable, at least in its current form. Although, like I said earlier during my talk, I think in response to one of the questions, I'm surprised it made it this long. When you look at some of the stats as far as like the national debt, unfunded liabilities, imperial overstretch abroad.
It's become like it was bad, but the last 3 years, holy shit.
Yeah, and it does tend to accelerate, right? Like the old idea of like, well, how did you go bankrupt? Well, at first slowly and then real fast, Yeah, I honestly, I have a hard time because I mentioned the things that I've seen in lots of different imperial collapses and whatever that seem to be common things to happen. But, each one of those is different in terms of its exact specific nitty-gritty details. And then there's also all these wild cards we have today that didn't exist previously, like the internet, nukes, the fact that the United States has been closer to a global hegemon than any other empire previously. And so what does that mean, when it collapses for like the world economy and all that? Because you can have an empire that's very dysfunctional and causes a lot of problems, but if it suddenly collapses or disappears, it doesn't necessarily mean everything gets better right away. Because like the Romans, as dysfunctional as they were in their latter years, they still were at least some of the time like suppressing pirates in the Mediterranean and, doing some things that had some benefit to people. And then you leave and it turns into just flat out Mad Max Road Warrior. Not necessarily an improvement, as oppressive as the empire might have been. We're not necessarily going to transform automatically by default into anarchotopia.
Yeah. So who is our big, what's our most immediate threat? Us or outside? Or
I think it's much more from within. And I don't know. I'm very concerned, in particular, about activities by the various three-letter mafia gangs of the intelligence community.
Every time something happens and it's blamed on something, I always immediately default to it was them.
Yeah. I'm tired of being right.
And just the fact that you could tell somebody that your federal FBI or whatever is responsible for this, and everybody I fucking know is like, oh yeah, I thought the exact same thing, right? And then you talk to people that are kind of like not in your group, and those conversations come up. Just the fact that you could post that up, and the majority of citizens from whatever side you're on would agree with you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, just two recent examples that seemed really obvious to me that I'm shocked that even all the blue-pilled NPCs in the world still believe it, because it just seems so obvious, are the January 6th staged cosplay riot and the explosion of the Nord Stream pipeline.
Yeah.
Like both of those things the second they were on the news, I was like, oh, this is, not what people think it is.
And everyone except our government said the United States did it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and it makes no sense that Russia would blow up their own pipeline in those circumstances. There's like no rational way for it. And like I give a little bit of indulgence to people. Like I've covered on my podcast in a lot of detail the explosion of the USS Maine in 1898, and I honestly believe it was a false flag carried out in part by members of the Office of Naval Intelligence. And I can kind of cut people some slack in 1898. Because in 1898, if the newspaper said, oh, the Maine blew up and the damn Spanish did it or whatever, like you didn't have a whole lot of alternative sources of information or whatever. And so like, all right, I'll cut those people some slack that they bought it. They had nowhere else to go for information. But, in today, if CNN tells you that Putin blew up his own pipeline, it doesn't take a whole lot of just, even Googling.
Right. Why would you do that?
Yeah, let alone DuckDuckGo. And, yeah, I don't know. I just have an increasingly hard time putting myself in the shoes of the blue-pilled NPC as far as continuing to believe, like, what CNN tells you to believe or whatever like that. Like, at this point, I have a hard time understanding how anybody could still believe anything they say at this point.
It's funny that they will support that so rabidly when at the same time, I mean, I think they have to know that we are not the good guys here.
You would think so. You would think so.
Why do they hold on so rabidly to something that like, what do they gain from it? I think it's because that if they turn on those are the people that feed them. I think a lot of them, if they have a job, it is because it is a bureaucrat job, right? It's a job that somebody has to use, not a service that you seek, or they don't create a good. So they are kind of on that system. Just like when you say, okay, let's do a 10%. If there's a 10% flat tax, the IRS will bring in more money than they do on the normal tax basis right now. But there's people that argue, but then the IRS would be out of business, right? And who the fuck is arguing that? Like I have to, and I don't know. I mean, I know what I do, and I know what people that I'm involved with do, but there's just this group of it's. I look at it as it's the most fucking insane, and we amplify the voice. And then through social media, suppress the masses, right? So that you feel like you're alone. They talk about this silent majority. Well, where the fuck? When is this? How far can the silent majority push before the government kills them?
Yeah,
I know I didn't really just ask anything there, but
yeah. Well, one thing I'm still trying to figure out, and may not be able to without hindsight, if we make it that long, is what Elon Musk is really up to.
What is he? Yeah, is he the good guy or is he the bad guy?
Yeah. I mean, I certainly don't 100% trust him. But at the same time, if you look at what, just by buying Twitter and making it somewhat more free.
Well, he bought a crime scene.
Yeah. Yeah. And then exposing all the Twitter file stuff and whatever like that. Like, is he like a rogue member of the power elite in a way?
Do you think, yes, and do you think that all the crazy shit that's happening currently is to draw attention from those files? Because I don't see people talking about them like they did.
Yeah, and the mainstream media has mostly just ignored it. And then you had, Matt Taibbi and those other journalists being grilled and called so-called journalists and things like this, where, I tweeted something kind of clever that I can't remember exactly what it was, but something about, like, if you think Matt Taibbi is a fake journalist, but Brian Stelter is a real journalist, like, you're just fucking insane.
Right, and half your CNN crew is no longer even employed. I mean, they're definitely not employed by CNN anymore, and that used to be where everybody got their news.
Yeah, well, what was a sort of a little mini red pill moment for me back when I was maybe like a teenager, I used to watch Jeopardy a lot, and one of the things that just sort of like little moment to wake me up into things are not what you think they are was they would do Celebrity Jeopardy. And I remember I was watching Celebrity Jeopardy, and most of the contestants were big name corporate news, TV anchors and stuff. It was like, I remember Wolf Blitzer and maybe like one or two other of the big names from the 90s, these are like the most trusted journal. They're like the modern Walter Cronkite and whatever. And then against them was a comedian. I don't remember who it was. It was, some sort of fairly well-known comedian from the 90s. Wasn't somebody quite as big as Jerry Seinfeld or whatever, but it was a comedian. And maybe it was, I don't know. But what blew me away was that Wolf Blitzer didn't know shit about shit. Like, he was like negative $10,000, like couldn't answer any question whatsoever. And the dude who was a comedian was killing it. And that was just a big like wake up moment to me at like age 16 or whatever I was at the time. I'm just like, oh, so the guy with the tie and, you know, the fancy lapel pin, who speaks from a teleprompter or whatever, he actually doesn't know a damn thing about anything.
Well, look at Carlin. I mean, now that Carlin's gone, and we hear when you hear something from Carlin today, you're like, holy shit, who is this guy? Because we weren't paying attention to him then.
Yeah.
My kind of wake up, I think, was David Icke. David Icke would put a lot of compilations together, or some of his people, or even who's InfoWars.
Alex Jones,
right? So that you see these compilations, but Icke especially called them news readers, right? They don't report the news; they just read the news, and they're all issued the news at 4 a.m. And they'd have these compilations of 1,000 different news companies saying the exact same fucking thing.
Yeah, and in the same words, not even changing the words. Yeah, and so when that movie Anchorman, with Will Ferrell, when that came out, that was just killing me. Where you could put anything on his teleprompter, and as long as it was on the teleprompter, he would just say it mindlessly.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah, that's another wild card I didn't really talk about that maybe is worth considering, which is that there's never been an empire going through collapse with the degree of media technology and therefore propaganda capability. Because the most recent big empire to fall apart was the Soviet Union, and you know, that was 1989 to 1991, but there was no internet as we know it, or social media as we know it at the time.
Landlines and beepers.
Yeah, and even in the Soviet Union, because it was, you know, so economically backward because of communism, they didn't even have the degree of like TV technology that we had and whatever, and so their TV propaganda was so much more crude than the American equivalent even at that time. And so we've never seen an empire go through decline and possible collapse in an era where there's this degree of capability to propagandize people. And then the flip side is also this degree to censor and manipulate, and to do it in a way that's very subtle and invisible to most people most of the time. Because if Elon, for example, had not bought Twitter and exposed the Twitter files, you and I and probably everybody at this event would be very suspicious. Like we would be like, oh, I know Twitter is, you know, manipulating things and censoring people, but you can't prove it.
Right.
And so if he hadn't bought Twitter and exposed all that stuff, we would still just sound like crazy ranting conspiracy theorists, even though we were right. But he provided us with the smoking gun. But you know, one of the things I've studied a lot in history and talked a lot about on my podcast is propaganda and censorship, and I'm going to do more stuff related to that going forward. But if you look back at the U.S. during World War I, there was a huge amount of propaganda and censorship, even though the U.S. was only in the war for less than 2 full years. But a lot of it was very blatant, particularly the censorship. Like, Woodrow Wilson's administration was throwing people in prison under the Sedition and Espionage Acts, and they were, you know, forcibly shutting down publications they didn't like and whatever like that. But the thing about that is, that's obvious to people, and it seems like that put a lot of average Americans, it put a lot of them off. Because, for example, like even if you're a mainstream patriotic American in like 1917, and you're totally bought into like, oh yeah, we got to go to war to save democracy and all this stuff. But if you see some anti-war activists give a speech, and maybe you don't agree with their speech, but all you see them do is just give a speech, and then in comes, you know, federal marshals or whatever, drags them off to prison. Like, that's so blatant and so obvious and heavy-handed that even if you're not in agreement with their content, you're still going to be like, this doesn't seem right in the United States of America with the Bill of Rights and all that. And I think the American elite, they learned from that, because there was a lot of public backlash during and after World War I against the heavy-handedness of it. And so I think what they've been doing ever since is gradually refining their techniques to make them more subtle and less obvious and less off-putting to the general public. And even as soon thereafter as World War II, like World War II, there was also a huge amount of propaganda and censorship. But a lot of it was much more kind of low-key, behind-the-scenes sort of stuff versus obvious, right up front heavy-handedness. And I think they've only just refined it ever since to where, ideally you want your propaganda to not seem to be propaganda to
right.
almost
Not
anybody.
to be questioned.
And the same thing with your censorship. Your censorship is more effective if it's invisible, because then people don't even realize that any manipulation is going on. And it's so much more effective versus, you look at like the latter days of the Soviet Union, nobody trusted what was in the newspaper or what was on TV. They all knew it was bullshit. Whereas American propaganda is so much more slick and subtle, I think it fools a lot more people.
Right. And it's not like you can just publish an underground newspaper. Nobody reads newspapers anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, we're reliant on there still being corners of the internet here and there that are not.
Yeah. We get people censored on one platform, go to the other, and people won't even follow them to the other platform.
Yeah.
Right? A few people do, but.
Yeah, that's why, I've thought about that. Decades from now, if the American empire does end in some fashion and we're still around to think about it and write history books about it, that it's possible that Elon buying Twitter and starting to free it up again and exposing the Twitter files potentially could be like a big milestone. Because one of the things I said towards the end of my talk today is that I think that in a lot of ways, sort of like the final straw that causes an empire to collapse is when the narrative breaks. That one of the things empires are built on are narratives. That you have to have people believing that your state is good, just, inevitable, on the right side of history, and even if things aren't perfect now, is working towards a better future. And those narratives of empires, they never quite match up with reality, but there's like degrees of divergence, So if, like, let's say your triumphalist narrative of your exceptional empire's God-given mission in the world or whatever, let's say the narrative seems to most people to be like, maybe 10% off from the reality. That can probably still hold together, and people will still obey and pay their taxes and be patriotic. But when it's like blatantly obvious that like your narrative of your empire is like 99% totally the opposite of the reality, that's where even the normies who don't really think about this stuff start to go, wait a minute, the TV guy tells me we're in this wonderful, prosperous utopia, and like there's no food on the shelf, and there's
Right.
toxic chemicals.
So when do you think the spark gets ignited?
I don't know.
I don't
that
think
could
it
be
does,
anything.
as long as they got Netflix and fucking popcorn.
Yeah, and that's another brilliant thing. I think that and it's not just the U.S. that sort of evolved this. Like most Western first world countries, I think, evolved this maybe after World War II. If you think about the Great Depression, one of the things that often occurs to people's minds is these images of like hungry poor people standing in line to get soup, right? And they've made it so that it's so much more invisible and hidden. So if, you're waiting at home to get some sort of like a welfare check and an EBT card and whatever it is, there could be a situation where like huge percentages of your population are living off of those sorts of things, but people wouldn't be aware because it's largely invisible.
I think there are. So, yeah, I think there is. I mean, they walk amongst us, right? We don't have you don't have to go to a line and stand in line to get your box of food. They have a debit card and they stand in line, and occasionally, it used to be, I don't know how it is now, but it used to be that you'd see them running an EBT card and a check and writing multiple checks and just breaking it up because you couldn't buy cigarettes and you couldn't buy Mountain Dew. But now you just have a debit card and you can buy everything with it.
Well, even if there's not certain things you can buy with that card, money's fungible. So it's like, okay, I'm going to use that card to buy my staples. Guess what? That leaves a few more extra bucks in my pocket to buy,
Right.
40s and menthols or whatever it might
Whatever it
be,
is.
But yeah, you think about like if you're in a society where there's huge lines of people waiting in line to get bread, well, people are going to be looking around going, wow, there's a lot of us that can't seem to get by without this. Maybe this whole system is fucked and should be replaced or whatever. But if it's all invisible and you're just at home, watching Netflix or whatever,
Right.
you don't have that sense of like the system is breaking down and seems to be unjust and unsustainable. And so, an interesting thing that happened in the latter stages of the Soviet Empire was in Poland, where, a big thing to Poland was when you got a Polish Pope in 1979 or whatever it is, when John Paul II became Pope. I think he was the first Polish Pope in history. And Poland was under the boot of a Soviet, sock puppet communist dictatorship that was, like most communist regimes, anti-traditional religion. Poland, a very religious Catholic country going back many centuries. And when John Paul came to Poland to preach, millions of people came out to see him. And that was a big deal because if you were isolated in your little apartment, you had no sense that like, oh, actually there is this silent majority, huge number of people that thinks communism is bullshit and they'd rather have their traditions and their culture and their religion. But when it's you walk outside and like literally every single one of your neighbors that you assumed most of them probably bought into the communist propaganda because in public they pretended to do lip service to it and whatever. But then you see that revealed preference versus the stated preference of like, no. Actually, most of my neighbors would rather, listen to this guy than listen to our communist regime tell us what to do. And so, I don't know if there's sort of like an equivalent, maybe on social media or whatever, where like everybody walks outside who doesn't buy the bullshit and then realizes like, oh, there's actually a lot more of us.
Yeah, I think that's happening.
Yeah.
We just need Elon Musk to now buy YouTube.
Yeah, and buy all the other social media companies and whatever like that. Yeah, I'm not sure what to make of him as far as like, is there a factional kind of war going on within the power elite? Because that does happen. And one of the things I think people often get wrong who go down the conspiracy rabbit hole is sometimes I think they have a tendency to see it as being more monolithic than it is. And so they think like there's just this one, everybody's in lockstep reading from the same script and whatever like that. It's like, no, there's always factions.
Yeah, I think when they try to enforce insidious things on population, like in the United States, for instance, right? I think there's people that enforcing it that actually believe it, but I think it's much more insidious at the higher levels, right? Like we need to depopulate, we need these people to move, rewilding kind of stuff. Sounds great on paper to some people, and some people actually enforce and believe it. But I think that the top echelon that actually can make it happen, I think it's way more insidious.
Yeah. No, it's also possible that when there's these sort of like civil wars or factional rivalries or whatever within the power elite that, let's see, how would I put it? That sometimes the lesser of two evils really is a thing when you're talking about that.
Yeah.
Where, in the way I've put it, I don't even know if I'm really half joking about it, but basically, okay, if I've got to be ruled by a billionaire plutocrat, if I have to, and the choice is between Elon Musk versus Bill Gates.
Yeah, I like what Elon Musk says a lot better than Bill Gates.
I'll take Elon Musk any day of the week over Bill Gates. Like,
yeah.
I don't think he's as bad. I may not trust him or agree with him on everything, but I don't think he's as bad. And, I agree with at least some of what he says he believes.
Have you gone down the Bill Gates rabbit hole?
Somewhat.
So is any of it real, or is...
I definitely think he's a sinister character for sure. I can't say that I've done a huge amount of research into the nitty gritty of everything about him, but yeah, for sure. I think he's one of the more sinister, and it's somehow even worse that he's like got this dorky Mr. Rogers persona with his little sweaters and whatever like that. Somehow that makes him seem more sinister to me. I did a Twitter poll not too long ago where I said something like, which of the following best embodies the phrase the banality of evil? And my options, I'm trying to remember, I think there was Bill Gates, Joe Biden, Justin Trudeau, and there was one other one. I can't remember who it was. But it's basically, I was starting to think of like all of the kind of powerful people. Maybe they're a plutocrat like Bill Gates. Maybe they're a sock puppet, but still a powerful sock puppet like Joe Biden or Justin Trudeau. But these people that you look at them and you're like, this is, number one, an extremely unimpressive person. Just
right. How has somebody
like,
not eaten him?
Yeah. I mean, Bill Gates comes out and he's got like his weak, wimpy little physique with his man boobs and whatever, and he's like, "Oh, I'm going to tell you how to eat healthy." And it's like, really? I'm going to eat what you eat?
Yeah,
Will I look like how you look? Where like Elon Musk, say what you will about him, but like he's accomplished things. He seems to be pretty intelligent. But yeah, this whole banality, I mean, I don't know. I just have a hard time. Maybe it's because I'm old school and like I grew up when there were still lots of like playground brawls and whatever.
Yeah.
But like, I don't know. I just look at somebody like Justin Trudeau and I'm like, you're just such a bitch. Like,
yeah.
Why would I do what you say? Why would I obey you? I don't think you ever even were in like a second grade playground.
How is anybody, they say if just 1% of the people who got traffic tickets in a day actually showed up to court, it would completely crash the entire system.
That's true.
How is anybody following Justin Trudeau? What's the fear there? The point of the gun from law enforcement?
Probably.
Like you took a population of people, Australia, Canada, and you disarmed them, right? They didn't have a First Amendment. Well, it's because they didn't have a First Amendment. Okay, but you have a group of people who all had guns, right? Mm-hmm. So how did they get to the point where this is even a discussion?
Yeah. I've heard it argued, and I think there's maybe something to it, that if you look at like how Canada and Australia got like self-government within the British Empire, they got it through gradual political reform. Parliament would pass something giving them a little bit more autonomy, and then 30 years later they'd pass something giving them a little bit more self-government, and basically they did that because of the lesson of the American Revolution. They realized, the British Empire realized after the American Revolution, like, oh, at least when it comes to the white colonies, we need to try to avoid a scenario like the American Revolution. And so we need to be willing to give them a little bit more home rule every time they start to get a little bit grumpy within the empire. And so what that meant was that, the way that Australia became a self-governing thing was not through harsh resistance and even open rebellion. It was through gradual political processes and things. And like in the short run, that might be great because it means you don't have to fight a bloody revolutionary war to get your independence. But then because you got your independence sort of like within the system, instead of taking a stand to leave it, then that leaves kind of like, I don't know, maybe a psychological or ideological residue that is particularly geared against any idea of outright resistance or rebellion. Whereas since Americans got their independence from the British Empire through actual real rebellion, then that left us with this sort of like psychological residue almost, or legacy of seeing it more that way. Like of not obviously not everybody, but a more significant percentage than in like Australia, who when they hear the government wants to pass new gun control immediately is like, oh, to hell with this, we need to resist whatever. And it's been eroded for sure in the US, but at the same time, I think there's clearly still a difference. I think it also helps too to have a written Bill of Rights that includes freedom of speech and right to bear arms, among other things. Not that I believe, like, obviously that's not a magical thing that restrains the government from doing what it can get away with. But I think that just by having it explicitly written down, it at least gives people the ability to point to and say, look, here's this clear amendment that's like in very straightforward language. Look what they're doing.
Right.
It clearly contradicts it. Whereas if you don't have that, there's I'm trying to remember, like there's not explicit, even in the Canadian equivalent of like the Constitution and Bill of Rights, which I forget, it's like the Charter of Freedoms or whatever. There's nothing as clear cut as the First Amendment when it comes to freedom of speech and expression. And instead of having these promises of what political scientists would call negative liberties, right, saying the government can't mess with this, the government can't encroach upon that, instead they've got these like vague guarantees where it's like, we promise you order and good government. It's like, okay, that might sound nice, but what the hell does that mean?
Right.
And so then it becomes even more. I mean, people still argue about what the First or Second Amendment mean. Imagine if instead of something like that, you had something so mealy-mouthed and wishy-washy as like, we promise to bring you good government and order. Okay. I mean, I'm sure, Kim Jong-un probably would say that's what he's up to in North Korea, is trying to bring good government and order. So, we do have some advantages over some of those people just by having that legacy. And yeah, I don't know. I'm not one of these. I know there's sort of like a growing movement of like monarchists amongst some of the post-libertarian types or whatever. And they're like, oh, we need to go back to monarchy. I'm like, I don't think that's a good solution to where we're at.
Do you think there's such an attack on the Second Amendment so that they can then go after the First Amendment?
Oh yeah. I think when you look at some of the like really excessive, even COVIDian things that happened in places like Australia, and they didn't happen here, but even here, you look at where did the most extreme COVIDian stuff happen? It happened in the states that have it happened in the states that have the most gun control,
mm-hmm.
and that have the most, urbanized population, right? It happened in New York and California and these sorts of places. And I don't even think it's necessarily that like people in other states were explicitly saying to their governors or whatever, hey, if you do these things, we'll rebel and shoot you. It's almost more just like you don't even have to get to that level if there's a culture.
Mm-hmm.
There's just in certain parts of this country, there's still that culture of fuck you, don't tread on me, whatever. And
we were arresting guys on surfboards out in the ocean and Hasidic Jews on playgrounds and stuff. They weren't rolling up in the hood trying to lock you out. They weren't in Compton telling them, hey, you can't go outside. That's true. How much further do they have to push till they show up and they start like just some like, I don't really know how to say this. They come in with all this bullshit and people have just had enough and they're like, okay, we're going to not do that anymore because every time we do this, they fuck us up, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where is that? I think they are very careful as to how heavy-handed they are. Like, I think they come in the middle of the night and make a big example out of people so that other people kind of get that feeling like, oh, we shouldn't do this. But I mean, it's only going to take a couple of instances where that spark gets lit and other people are like, okay, well, if we fucking fight back hard, they're going to stop coming because they might not go home tonight. Yeah, it's a tricky situation too, to put yourself in the shoes of, say, the political ruling class. If you wanted to, let's say, disarm the American population and nullify what's left of kind of the First Amendment as well and things like that, where it's a very dangerous situation from their perspective in that if you move too far too fast, you provoke resistance. And so it's a balancing act where you want to be kind of eroding the rights and freedoms, but doing it so gradually and incrementally and low-key and whatever that you don't spark that resistance. Because, that's a lot of people who've not studied the origins of the American Revolution don't realize General Gage, who was the commander-in-chief of British forces in North America, as well as the governor of Massachusetts when the fighting broke out in 1775, he actually was somewhat sympathetic to a lot of the American colonists' complaints. He was politically sort of what they would call a Whig, which was, kind of like a small L liberal kind of a guy, somewhat sympathetic to a lot of the complaints the colonists had. But, he was a loyal, patriotic British subject and a career soldier and whatever. So at the end of the day, he was like,
Yeah, I'm sympathetic to a lot of their complaints, but at the same time, the king and parliament are sovereign, and the law is the law, and orders are orders. But when he started to try to confiscate primarily gunpowder in Massachusetts in 1774-75, his goal was he wanted to prevent violence. Now, he ended up ironically providing the incident that sparked it, with Lexington and Concord. But his goal was not to provoke. His goal was to, kind of with lightning raids and whatever like that, like skillfully take away the colonists' ammunition before they could even get to the point of being so provoked that they would rise up explicitly. And so, I don't know, I think some of the smarter people in the elite classes kind of understand that they have to be very careful to not move too far too fast. And in a way, it's kind of beneficial when they occasionally overextend themselves and kind of like a good example. And sometimes they end up having to retreat very quickly after they do something. And a good example of this is the Ministry of Truth.
Yeah.
That they were trying to roll out.
I don't think it went away. I think they just told you it went away.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely happening in like a decentralized, unofficial kind of a thing.
I can't believe they named it the Ministry of Truth.
Is that what they were actually calling
No,
it?
but
Okay.
I mean, that's what was public facing. I mean,
They had that crazy lady who did the Mary Poppins song and whatever like that.
Jankowicz or whatever her name was.
Yeah. That was. I mean, I thought that was great.
Yeah.
Because it's like they took the mask off for a minute. And I think at least some amount of normies got red pilled.
Or when you're high heel lipstick wearing mohawk, luggage stealing, and then it came out that he had fucking stolen luggage dozens of times.
Yeah.
And the lady came out and she's like, "Those are my dresses. They're one of a kind. I'm a designer. Here they are." Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's great when they occasionally let the mask slip one way or another, because it usually at least a few more people are going to wake up. But yeah, I don't. It's hard to predict. I mean, imagine you were sitting around in North America in like 1773, 74. Like, could anybody have predicted exactly when and how it's going to go down?
Right.
That would have been very hard. It's sort of like a powder keg situation where it's like, all right, what's going to set this off? Could be anything.
What percentage of people then took up arms?
Off the top of my head, I don't remember, but it would have been definitely single digits.
Wild ass guess, yeah. Single digits. But there was a lot of people that assisted.
Sure, yeah.
Ethan Allen.
Yeah.
Different companies, okay, they just funded and gave equipment, moved messages, fed people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you definitely, you need a supportive civilian population. Even though the American Revolution wasn't a pure insurgency, a lot of it was in the form of essentially insurgency. You sort of had like the regular continental armies operating, but you also had all the different official and unofficial state and local militias and things like that. So
the underground.
Yeah. Great book, by the way, for anybody watching, listening. If you've not read it, to really understand the early phases of the American Revolution, is a book called American Insurgents, American Patriots by a historian named T.H. Breen. And it focuses in on like the earliest phases of the revolution and how it very much was like a decentralized, bottom-up sort of a thing. And it's not how the American Revolution is taught in most, K through 12 or college classes. The impression you get in most K through 12 and college classes when you cover the American Revolution is like, oh yeah, there were leaders. You had Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin and John Adams and all those guys, and they were in charge, and they decided like, oh, we're going to have independence and let's do this. And then the people out in the provinces were like, okay, we've got our orders from Philadelphia, let's do what we're told. And the reality is it was a whole bunch of like super decentralized local militias organized usually by town in Massachusetts that nobody was ordering them to go take up arms or whatever. They did it on their own initiative. And all you got to do is look at a calendar. It's like the outbreak of violence was April 19, 1775. The Declaration of Independence wasn't, fully passed by the Congress till July of 1776. So that means regular people on their own initiative were leading themselves and mobilizing and fighting and killing and dying and fighting battles for well over a year before the guys in charge in Philadelphia could get around to writing up an official document and everything like that. And so if a woman got pregnant on April 19th, 1775, she would have had, let's see, a baby that was, what, I taught history, not math, but she'd have a baby that was a year and 6 months, or 6 months old or something like that by the time the Declaration was written.
Mm-hmm.
And that gets kind of lost in the narrative a lot, is a sense of time. That like, oh yeah, you had Lexington and Concord. And in a history book, especially if it's a textbook, it's like the next paragraph, the Declaration of Independence is being written. And in reality, it's like, no, it was a year and 3 months.
Do you think true history is still being taught, like in high school?
I think there are occasional rogue teachers.
I think they get weeded out pretty quickly.
I think some do, some don't. I think it depends on where you are. Like if you're in a New York City or L.A. School, yeah, you're probably not going to last long. But
I hear we just had millions of kids not come to school this school year, right? So those kids went where? Homeschool, private school.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a smoldering fire, and there's a wind that is blowing on that fire, and it looks very evident that that fire is growing. And I don't know, man. I'm hopeful. At the same time, just keep doing the things that we know we need to do.
Yeah.
And it's that you're not alone kind of thing, right? Like you just said, it wasn't fought by an organized army. It was several individual little groups operating on their own. And when the time comes, hopefully there's enough of us that we can come together to do what we need and then fizzle back out into the wind.
Yeah, and, doesn't even necessarily, may not need to be violent. I would prefer it not to be for a lot of reasons. But, again, that's why I tend to go back a lot to the Soviet collapse, where in most instances it was peaceful. In most places that it happened. And I'm actually going to be doing some coverage in particular of the Czechoslovakian anti-communist movement that eventually led to the collapse of communism there, because they're particularly interesting, because the guys who spearheaded the so-called Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, led by Václav Havel, they were very unusual for successful revolutionaries in that they were actually like intellectuals and artists and things like this. They were playwrights and whatever like that. And part of their movement actually got sparked by the communist regime in Czechoslovakia suppressing a rock band. Trying to remember, they had a goofy name. It was like the Plastic Humans of the World. It was some kind of silly name that this rock band had that was sort of a dissident rock band. And the regime in Czechoslovakia cracked down on them hard as, dangerous or whatever like that. And that sort of sparked the movement. And not only that, but the Czech dissidents, in Poland it was different, because in Poland it was basically working class union guys in the Solidarity movement who started off not trying to overthrow communism, but just trying to get better working conditions and stuff like that. So that was a little bit different. But in Czechoslovakia, it was more of kind of egghead intellectuals like me, who they had a whole sort of theory of what they were doing. And I think what they said and wrote and ultimately did needs to be more widely understood by, kind of, for lack of a better term, our sorts of people, because they had this whole idea of what they called a parallel society. And their idea was don't go frontally attack or confront the state, because that's the game they're good at. That's the game they play. And so instead of trying in some way directly to resist the communist state, just build your own alternative institutions.
Kind of the Atlas Shrugged things. We're not
sort of.
You can have it. Here it is. We're going to go over here.
Yeah. And build your own institutions and organizations and movements that are just separate. Don't try and fight the state, but just kind of walk away from it as much as you can.
Have you heard of Black Wall Street?
No.
Kind of same thing they did until the government came in and actually bombed them.
Oh yeah. Where was that?
I don't know. They burned the whole town down, though.
Yeah. Wasn't that
It's
like
the first time bombs were used against U.S. citizens within the United States. They dropped propane bombs. It was black folks,
yeah.
and they couldn't get financing and funding, so they set up their own bank, and
Yeah.
they set up all their own grocery stores and everything.
Yeah. Yeah, and that sort of thing happened a lot back in the segregation days, where the black people would be like, "All right, you don't want to, welcome us into your institutions or whatever. We'll build our own." And then a lot of times
Yeah, we can't have that. No, you have to stay suppressed.
Yeah.
So you have some books out?
Books? No. I'm working on one.
Okay, what's the book going to be on?
The first one I'm working on is just unless I come up with a different title. The working title is Dangerous American History.
I like it.
And it's just going to be sort of an intro to, I don't know if it'll end up being like 10 things or what the number will be by the time I'm done. But it'll be a bunch of big picture things that I came to believe about American history that most people don't realize or don't think. And so let me give you a couple of examples of the ones I know I'm going to do chapters on. One of them is going to be the United States is an empire and always has been.
Oh, fuck yes, it is. Yeah.
Which, to a lot of us here at this event, like, of course, but, you go into just like random people on the street in a store or whatever, they're like, what are you talking about?
Well, duh.
Yeah. Another one is something like, the United States is an oligarchy and always has been.
All right.
Things like that, where it's just saying things that, to me are self-evident, but I have to remind myself to a lot of normies out there are blasphemy, So things like that, and then go through and make my case specifically, like, okay, what is an empire? What's the definition of an empire? Does the United States have the characteristics that fulfill the definition of an empire, and make my case? And the same thing with an oligarchy. Woodrow Wilson talked about modern democracy. That's what he thought, America was progressing towards, modern democracy. But if you look at what he actually thought modern democracy would be, it's basically not even real democracy. Like there's all sorts of criticisms of democracy in sort of libertarianish circles, and I agree with a lot of them. But when people are like, oh, the American system is so screwed up because it's a democracy and democracy sucks, it's like, well, democracies often suck, but I don't think what we have is even a democracy.
But you don't realize.
You're criticizing it for something it's not. And so my little quote that I'm probably eventually going to put on some merch or whatever is, modern democracy is just oligarchy with extra steps.
Yep.
It's basically, it's an oligarchy, but you have these sort of like sham kabuki dance WWF elections and whatever like that.
Yeah.
But what do our elected representatives actually do? Well, 99.9% of the time they do what the oligarchs,
Yeah, it's World Wrestling Federation. Yeah. So where do people find you?
You can search for Dangerous History Podcast wherever you consume your podcasts. You should find it there, and if you just go to dangeroushistorypodcast.com, you'll find my homepage.
Are you on YouTube?
I am on YouTube recently. Should be Dangerous History on YouTube, and you'll see my little logo. It incorporates the radioactive symbol, so you'll know it's me. And I haven't done much on YouTube yet, but I've recently set it up, and I already have several hundred subscribers. So
you can rip all of your audio and put it on YouTube, and you can make it auto-populate every time you post to YouTube to Rumble.
Okay.
Automatically. Last question. Is the Titanic really the ship on the bottom of the ocean?
What's the story on that? It was J.P. Morgan insurance scam or whatever like that?
Have you heard how many people actually had staterooms on the Titanic that got off within like 12 hours of it departing?
No.
Yeah, those people became the U.S. Fed.
I wouldn't put anything past them. It's just something I've not dug into.
Yeah.
But yeah, if the Maine is a false flag and everything else is a false flag, then it's certainly possible.
Well, thanks for sitting down.
My pleasure.
I totally didn't know how to do this podcast with you. I've listened to some of your content, but I'm sitting here with a history professor, and I am absolutely not that.
Okay. Well, I hope I was mostly coherent and made sense sometimes.
All good, man. Awesome.
Cool.
Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. It's been fun.